Well, China is definitely backing Russia. The main thing it's doing is buying copious amounts of Russia's natural energy and gas and oil, and it's getting it at bargain prices, and they're also expanding their trade. But beyond that, the Chinese are not actively supporting what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And to be honest with you, they're probably behind the scenes a little bit embarrassed that they've gone far enough to support Putin. They've said Putin's goal in Putin's view, of trying to stop NATO expansion, that's his explanation why one of the reasons why he invaded Ukraine, is not going that well. So it's a bit like backing a bit of a failing endeavor. But now that you're backing it, you've kind of got to continue to back it. And the Chinese are just going to be hoping that either the Russians' fortune starts to improve or that the war ends within a sort of a reasonable time frame in the future.
China has always seen Russia as an ally, and I'm going to quote here, an ally in taking the global order in a more and just reasonable direction. That's according to a Beijing diplomat, top diplomat here. Do you see a possibility of these two leaders actually dictating the direction, the global direction?
Well, there's a thought, isn't there? A new world order, courtesy of China and Russia. In February, actually 4th of February, just before Russia invaded, the two leaders met. That's the last time they met before the meeting you mentioned just now. And they met in the Beijing Winter Olympics. Putin flew over to see President Xi, and the two governments, Russia and China, issued a grandiose document that expounded on those themes that you've mentioned, about a less Western-dominated, less unipolar, less US-led world order as being somewhat fairer. Well, I suppose the evidence is not great from the last 6, 7, 8 months of war in Ukraine. If this is what a new world order comprises of, where the large attempt to gobble up the small, we should all be pretty concerned. But I think just to rounding that off, again, it's actually more the economic side where I think this is more telling rather than the military, where you've got these two economies that are trading with each other a great deal in spite of Western sanctions. And that is actually a bit of a turn up for the books, I think.
All right, so let's talk about the war in Ukraine and what the advancement of the Ukrainian troops actually means for Russia now. And Putin has come under a lot of fire for the setbacks that Russian troops are currently experiencing. There has been criticism from nationalists as well. Do you think his presidency is at question here?
Well, I suppose if you're a dictator like Putin, then you always operate on the basis that someone may want to remove you from power. So it's really about how loyal the people immediately around him are and how thick his security state is to protect him. But you mentioned the Ukrainian military advances. Really worth just briefly recapping. I mean, they've retaken an enormous amount of territory around Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second city. But having said all of that, and the reason I wrote the book is I spent a year working as a ceasefire observer in the first Donbass war, 2014-15. And Ukraine is massive. So yes, Ukrainians have recaptured a significant swathe of their own territory. The Russians still hold about 20% of Ukraine, forcefully, and the Ukrainians still have a really long way to go to kick the Russians out entirely, something I think they will eventually start to struggle with a bit further down the line.
Okay, so let's turn our attention now to Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine, and he seems to be riding high on Ukraine's recent progress as well. Recently, he also vowed to recapture Crimea, which is currently under Russian reign. Would his domestic supporters support that, given that the war is dragging out?
Yeah, so Zelensky's proclamations are born of the confidence of a man who's leading an armed force, which is actually a little bit on the upswing, and there's momentum behind their advance. There's two things that the Ukrainians need to recapture, one of which is the land they lost after 24th February 2022, and the second thing, as you mentioned, Crimea, is the land they lost way back when I was working in Ukraine, 2014-15, that first Donbass war, as it was called, also parts of the east. And I think at that point you get to I think real difficult territory for the Ukrainians. Would they be able to do all of that before winter sets in? Very unlikely. Are we then talking about a Zelensky sort of a proclamation about how they continue to fight in 2023? And then there's the point about whether they can sustain not only their own public support, but they've already suffered at least 9,000 military casualties. The Ukrainians have admitted this. By next year, how many will they have suffered, and how long can they keep going on for fighting at this tempo?